r/ask Reddit. What is your darkest family secret? In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service, they get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the holdup is. When he gets back in, he says you won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple. Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple, Atlanta, 1958. He says what? Who would do such a thing? My uncle. That's who. Wasn't everyone acquitted in this case? Did your uncle ever admit to doing the bombing? Was he the main suspect? Sorry, that's a lot of questions. He was one of the 5 men arrested, but not the one tried and acquitted twice. I don't know if he ever confessed, but he was definitely the black sheep of the otherwise normal family. My dad, his sisters, and my other uncle rarely mentioned him, at least not while my cousins and I were around. But when I was little, I remember one of my older cousins saying something about my uncle and a church bombing. I thought better of asking dad about it, and basically forgot about it. Then, a few years ago, Elle was listening to the Myths in History podcast, and they did an episode on the bombing. When they listed the names of the men that were arrested, a giant light bulb went off in my head. No one in my family can give me an honest answer on how many siblings I have. A year or two after her adoptive mother died, my mom went looking for information about her birth parents, and found that her birth mom and her husband had been gruesomely murdered by a drug cartel. There was an article about their murder in Rolling Stone magazine that had gory pictures of their bodies. Must have been really shocking to her. Hope she's well now. Found out last year that I am a direct descendant Thomas Rood. He was the first person to be executed for incest in the US. He raped his daughter Sarah and it came to light when she gave birth to a son named George. My family line is descended from George. My dad's biological father was a Rood. I know almost nothing about that branch of my family tree, but we could be distant relatives. Tree, you have a family wreath, my friend. You know the Rood family motto. What comes around, goes around. Father won the lottery and we've been pretending to be poor so our family doesn't try to ask for money. I'm moneyed about tree fitty. It was at that moment I realized you wasn't no Girl Scout, but a 3-story tall crustacean from the Paleozoic era. So I'll say goddamit monster, we work hard for our money in this house. I learned my disabled great aunt was raped multiple times while she was in high school, including by a teacher, and it resulted in at least 3 pregnancies that she was forced to carry and give up for adoption, and then shamed for. I found out because I did 23andMe found cousins my dad couldn't explain, so there was a very awful phone call to understand why disabled women are at the highest risk for sexual assault. I am so sorry. My brother shot himself in the leg to get out of Iraq and tried to blame it on an enemy attack. I learned about this the day I arrived in Afghanistan for my year-long tour. All I heard was that he was shot. I found out later it was a self-inflicted wound and he was out on suicide watch and was kicked out with a less than honorable discharge. He's never actually told anyone this. I just heard it through the National Guard being kind of like a gossipy small town. I actually don't hold it against him. War sucked. He's absolutely ruined his life since then by becoming an alcoholic and sitting the world out. Just sad all around. Also, my mom and her sister married the same man, so all my siblings are also cousins with each other. Buried the lead, lol. I had an uncle who moved far away, worked in a boiler room at a huge casino. Decades ago. He was always sketchy, and he had way more money than a simple boiler room employee ought to have had. Rumors that the boiler room was a really useful thing for the mob, due to boilers doubling as incinerators for certain purposes. Hence the money. Many unanswered questions there. Guess it's kinda obvious that your uncle got paid to look the other way while the mob used the boiler room to cook their pizzas. One family member killed another by leaving a bag of poisoned donuts on the front steps. We are now hesitant about accepting donuts. Where do you live with such frivolous donuts dispersion? That's what I wondered. Me. I rarely get offered donuts. I found out 6 months before my dad died that he was a heroin addict earlier in his life. He was dying of liver disease and tried to overdose one night. I didn't live with him at the time but knew something was wrong, and that's when my mom and I went and found him on the floor of his bathroom with a needle in his arm. My dad, before he met my mom, was a heroin addict and got clean. Years later he was diagnosed with hep C, which developed into liver cancer. He commented that if he could he would just OD so he could just go to sleep and not wake up. I wouldn't take it as a relapse, just a way to end the pain. It's me. My dad never told his family I existed. I was shameful. Maybe he was more ashamed. After he died they found out about me and kindly asked me not to come to the funeral. I get why he never told them. My cousin sexually abused me when I was 7. He was 17. And it messed me up, and now I have to pretend I'm happy he's getting the organ transplant he needs. I hope he ducking dies. My grandma has been having an affair with a family friend's husband for 28 years. My great-great-grandmother had a black father and was considered really taboo in the 1860s. My great-grandmother is 98 years old and was telling us about a guy who was black and absolutely adored her in the 1920s and early 30s and would come over to play with her, but the family had to keep it a secret as he was black and she was white. Story goes that her grandmother married her grandfather. My great-grandmother's mom had to pretend that he worked as the help on the farm in South Dakota when he was really his father. She told us about it when my grandfather did a DNA test and it came back that he was part black and had black family members. We only found out last year. Dad's cousin was a prominent Catholic priest known for his staunchly anti-LGBT views. Well, it was quite the surprise when he was arrested trying to solicit a blowjob from an undercover cop at a gay bookstore in New Orleans. It's New Orleans. You can't really say you've really visited the French Quarter if you haven't had Café au lait and Big Nuts at Café du Monde, caught a jazz set at Preservation Hall, and gotten your knob slobbed in a bookstore. I wasn't going to answer this, but here I go. There was a man who was my grandmother's brother. My sister and I referred to him as Uncle Jay. Well, Uncle Jay was a weird dude, but then again my family on that side always seemed a bit out there. I found out many years later after he died of cancer that he was a rapist and no one in the family wanted to acknowledge it. He raped my mother and some of her cousins. Now we spent some holidays in the house that he lived in and he was always drunk, but I'm honestly ducking irate that my mother didn't keep us away from someone like him. Had he still been alive about 10 years ago I would probably have killed him myself once I found out what he did. Long story short, if you are the parent of young children and you don't keep them away from predators, you are failing your children. Protecting a rapist solely on the basis of family is ducking disgusting. As part of opening a home daycare, Mom found somebody on the sex offender registry with our family's very unusual last name. Mom called Grandpa. He confirmed that he is related to us. He hadn't seen him in decades. He didn't know he had been convicted for statutory but thought that sounded about right. We're not supposed to ask about him again. Good for your grandpa keeping dangerous people away from his family even if they are related to him. That's the right thing to do, and too many stories on here are unfortunately because people did the opposite. My great aunt had a thing for this guy. The problem was that this guy happened to be married. That little detail didn't stop my great aunt. So what did she do? Well, she killed the man's wife. Apparently when he went off to work early one morning, she broke into the house and killed the woman by sawing her off head. Then she cleaned up the mess, buried the body in the backyard, tidied the house up, cooked dinner and waited for the man to come home. When he got home he noticed the house was a bit different. Out comes my great to greet him. This was the first time the man had met my great aunt. And what did this man do? Well, he thought it was a great gesture of love. They called the police and he covered up for my great aunt's crime. Says he did it. He gets arrested and spends a couple of years in prison and then bribes his way out. He moves into his old home with my great aunt and they had a happy marriage for over 40 years later until he passed away from natural causes. When I was little I found out my mother was hated by her entire family due to she having a different mother than all her siblings, and I only know this because I was hated due to me having a different father than all of my siblings. So my grandmother told me, her biological mom, "It feels strange having so much family but have nobody even want to associate with you." My mom left me at 15 months old with my teenage father. Neither wanted me, but when my dad married my stepmom, She really hated me and the mother I never knew and told me all the time, "I understand how you feel." My grandma tried to kill my grandpa. My dad tells me that my grandpa was a controlling, emotionally abusive person and never let my grandma go out, even to church. But my dad also doesn't reveal much about the past. All I know is that there's a lot of resentment. Towards the end of his life, my grandpa had a stroke and was completely bedridden and couldn't speak. He was coherent and understood when we spoke to him. We had a full-time carer for him who would bathe him, feed him, etc. Because my grandma didn't want it. As it turns out, she was not giving him or the carer any food. Later we also found out that she wasn't giving him his medicines and would ignore him for hours when he had fits. She would not give him the adult diapers and let him lay in his filth for days. Eventually, my uncle took him in and they took over his care. Even though my aunt was recovering from breast cancer, he was doing well and recovered somewhat. My grandma sometimes visited him and asked to be left alone. Once the carer caught her trying to strangle him, and she threatened to call the cops. She just stayed quiet while my uncle kicked her out. This worsened his condition, and he was in the ICU for a while. At some point when she visited him, my grandma had also broken his arm. We didn't know because he couldn't verbalize it. Not the darkest secret, but definitely the most well kept. I grew up with my family in a small town in Texas. It was the 4th of July while I had my learner's permit to learn to drive. So I begged my aunt to ride with my sister and I to go and get fireworks so that I could drive. She said she would, but only if she could show us something first. She directed me to drive to one of the bridges in town in the middle of a very nice looking rich people neighborhood. On the bridge were spray painted 2 dongs, mid-ejaculation. Massive dongs drawn on the bridge. It was massively funny, and after we laughed at it we went and got the fireworks and went home. That next morning, my mom made everyone go to church. After the service was over, my mom went to the other group of middle-aged women and all of the women that lived in this particular neighborhood were all going, "Can you believe what someone has done to our neighborhood?" My sister and I could only side-eye each other. We didn't tell anyone we knew who it was, and my aunt was never caught. The dong showed up in some engagement photos before they were able to remove it. My grandfather was in the Klan. My great-grandfather was not only in the Nazi party, he was in the SS. He was killed in the war and my grandfather was adopted since his whole family was ripped apart. It's crazy to think how just a few generations can change so much, but still stay the same. Edit. I meant culturally things can stay the same. How people can still become brainwashed and still be so full of hate that they join little known hate groups like these. Obviously I'm not in the SS people. Jeez. My grandfather forced grandmother to take my aunt to have an abortion when she was 16, causing my aunt to become severely emotionally unstable. Cut her own face up so terribly bad that she wears a large amount of makeup to cover it and hasn't really gone outside in almost 45 years. Although she ended up marrying her high school sweetheart after that and had 2 children. From what I know she never forgave either of her parents. I only very recently learned this. I guess she didn't understand because my grandparents were married at 16 with child, which caused my grandmother to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church because she was already married. This part I was confused about. She was married at 15 to another and traveled to California to get a divorce and elope with my grandfather, who then immediately joined the Navy to fight in World War II Pacific Theater. Only recently I guess the church decided divorce is okay and she's allowed back into heaven now. My granddad made hundreds of millions through his business and investments by the time he died. Most of it though only happened a few years before he passed. He never got on well with the rest of the family apart from my parents. As a result, he left everything to charity in his will. Of course, the family weren't happy about this and wanted to get rich from his hard work. So they lawyered up and fought for years to get the money. Unfortunately they eventually won. Not all of it but most. Taking millions from needy charities and spending it on houses, cars, holidays and gambling. Lots and lots of gambling. Needless to say, we don't talk to that part of the family. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.